Hello. If you've trained as a general educator, perhaps teaching children or teenagers, you've probably encountered Bloom's taxonomy. But if you work in adult language education, especially English language teaching, it may be new to you. Even so, it's a powerful tool worth knowing. So let's start at the beginning. Bloom's taxonomy is a classification system for educational objectives. In simple terms, it's a way of describing what we want our learners to achieve, not just what they know, but how they think. It was originally developed by Benjamin Bloom and a large team of educators in the 1950s. After years of collaboration, they published the first version in 1956, and it offered 6 levels of cognitive challenge, each representing a different kind of thinking. In the original version, the categories were knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. These were arranged in a strict hierarchy from simple recall at the bottom to critical judgment and creative thinking at the top. But the taxonomy has since been revised. In 2001, Anderson and Krathwohl reworked it for modern educational use, and the revisions included 3 key changes. First, they switched from using nouns to verbs to reflect learning as an active process. So knowledge became remember, comprehension became understand, and so on. Second, they reversed the top 2 categories, putting create above evaluate to show that creativity often requires all other types of thinking. And third, the revised version allows for more overlap between levels, recognizing that thinking isn't always a neat staircase. You don't have to master one level completely before using another. So the 6 revised levels are now remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Let's briefly unpack what each level means, especially in a language classroom. Remember is the most basic level. It's about recalling facts, words, rules, forms, etc. For example, remembering that the past tense of go is went, or that adjectives come before nouns in English would be examples of remembering. Without memory, nothing else can happen. Understand goes a step further. It's about comprehension, grasping meaning. A learner might remember that the passive voice uses be plus the past participle, but understanding means knowing why and when it's used. It means answering how and why questions, not just what. Apply means using that understanding in real contexts. For example, applying knowledge of collocations to write a natural sounding email, or applying modal verbs to express advice or regret. Analyze requires breaking things down into parts. A student might analyze the structure of a narrative or dissect a sentence to identify its clauses and functions. It's about recognizing patterns, relationships, and hierarchies in language. Evaluate involves making judgments. A learner might evaluate whether a response was polite or rude, or assess the strength of an argument in a debate. Evaluation includes reasoning, critique, and defending ideas. Finally, create is the highest level. It means synthesizing all previous skills to produce something new, like designing a lesson plan, writing a poem, or giving a persuasive presentation. It's creative, original, and generative, but crucially it depends on everything that comes before. Now these 6 levels operate in conjunction with another part of the framework, the knowledge dimension. This asks what kind of knowledge the learner is working with. In the revised model, there are 4 types of knowledge. Factual knowledge, the basic bits, words, grammar rules, phonemes, etc. Conceptual knowledge, this is categories, principles, models, like how prepositional phrases function or what genre means in writing. Procedural knowledge, knowing how to do something, how to take notes from a lecture, how to infer meaning from context, or how to use discourse markers effectively. And finally, metacognitive knowledge, awareness of one's own thinking. For example, a learner might recognize that they read too quickly to grasp the main idea and deliberately slow down. Or they might consciously choose a strategy to signal when they've finished speaking in a conversation. Each of these types of knowledge can be used at each of the 6 thinking levels. So a learner might remember factual knowledge, apply procedural knowledge, or evaluate a conceptual framework. What's especially useful about Bloom's taxonomy is how it guides lesson planning and assessment. When planning, we can ask, are we only asking students to remember things, or are we helping them analyze and create? Are we starting with tasks that match their current abilities and building up toward more complex ones? For example, in a reading lesson, we might begin by asking learners to identify the subject and object in a sentence. That's remembering and understanding factual knowledge. Then we might ask them to reorder a jumbled text. That's applying and analysing procedural and conceptual knowledge. Later, we could ask them to judge the effectiveness of the text's argument, evaluation, and finally to write their own article on a similar theme, creation. It also helps in designing tests. A multiple choice vocabulary test probably only checks remembering. A gap fill exercise might test application. Asking students to write a critical review pushes them to evaluate and create. Importantly, the taxonomy reminds us not to assume that lower level language learners are only capable of lower level thinking. As has been noted, even students with basic English can evaluate and create if we design tasks carefully. Simple language does not mean simple minds. And Bloom's taxonomy isn't only for teachers, learners can benefit too. Making students aware of the different types of thinking can boost their metacognition, encourage autonomy, and help them reflect on their own progress. In practice, you don't have to apply all 6 levels in every lesson. Sometimes remembering is enough. Other times you'll aim for creativity. But having this framework allows you to calibrate the level of challenge. And that's key to effective learning. So Bloom's taxonomy isn't just a relic from teacher training, it's a living tool to help us answer one essential question. What are we actually asking our learners to do exactly with their knowledge? Thank you.